welcome back to another short video where we're going to be talking about, I suppose, a little bit more in depth than the original video I did within FMOD, but just some good starting points, some key commands, what these different windows are in terms of our events browser, our assets browser, our events editor, our deck, which is essentially our mixer, our parameters menu, our 3D preview, and just some basic key commands you might need to either access your assets. That was command and 3. Some general navigational points within the door, zooming in, zooming out, things like that. And just some sort of getting started within FMOD, looking at these logic tracks and seeing what they're doing, looking at different timelines, and just trying to kind of understand how this crazy but wonderful bit of software does work. So the first thing I'd say when you jump into FMOD, it seems obvious. If you go to FMOD Studio and Preferences, this is probably the first place you'll go anyway, right? Because you need to set what your output from FMOD is. How are you actually hearing your sound? So in my case right now, I'm going to Black Hole because I'm recording a vlog, but usually I'd be going to my audio interface, which on this particular computer is an ID4. There's a separate video that I've done talking about our metering, but this is very much looking at your surround outs. Now, most of us are probably working in stereo, so you're not going to always necessarily hear these discrete outputs from the door, but you do still need to be aware of direction and get a sense of that movement in terms of a 3D space, even when you're working in stereo, because this is how it's going to talk to the game engine overall. So this is all about metering. Most of you are just going to keep that in standard. And really, without getting too in depth at this point, you just need to think of almost like a surround sound system: front left, front right, center, LFE or our low frequency effects, left surround and right surround. If you've got these height and kind of side, almost going into a 714 or a 712 maybe, then you're lucky. We've not all got those set up, so it's just so you're aware of that. The main window you probably want to look at, outside of setting your audio out, is your shortcuts. So this is a really kind of basic way, I suppose, of figuring out what the different key commands within the software do. And I would recommend spending a little bit of time studying this. You can always change some of these parameters should you want to. If you want it to feel a little bit more like Ableton or more like Logic or more like Pro Tools, feel free to go in, double click into these areas and change your key commands as you so wish to do so. Don't worry about this door button. I know a lot of people, when they come to FMOD and they see that, they think, well, I can connect my door. Well, you kind of can, but you can only connect Reaper at this period of time. So if you're using Reaper on Windows or indeed on a Mac, then you can go ahead and connect Reaper to your door, which kind of makes the connection between FMOD and the door a lot more, there's a lot more synergy between the two programs, but this is kind of outside the remit of this video because we're focusing just on FMOD in itself. So once you've kind of set up your outputs, you've understood that just what these are doing. Like I say, I would think of it, guys: front left, front right, center, low frequency effects or your sub, left surround, right surround, and kind of put that out of your mind for now. And we just want to get into the actual door itself. You've got various different windows. You've got your events. So this will essentially house your entire game. So as you progress forward, you will be right clicking. You'll be creating a new folder. This will be called music. Then there may well be a 2D timeline, which we can call, say, pause menu. And that, of course, will drag within your music. Then you may have more timelines where we talk about, I don't know, let's call this level 1. New event, new 2D timeline, level 2. Now this can get as complicated or simple as you want it to be. You might have level 1, I'm type 2. You might have level 1 boss scene or level 1 easy or level 1 hard or level 1 battle music. That's kind of up to you and your design and what the conversations you've had with the games designer about how that's potentially going to play out. But the thing you want to just get into your mind right now is stay organized with your sessions. These are your events. They'll live in, I'm calling this FMOD master session. All your different events will live in this browser. You've then got your event editor, which essentially is where you will, of course, edit your event. This is what we call the deck, and it's very similar to anyone who's been working in Ableton will kind of understand this window. Here you've got what we call our logic tracks. If I go to a timeline, you'll see logic tracks. This has got nothing to do with Apple's Logic Pro. This is, I suppose, similar to what they might call global tracks. You will add things like tempo markers, loop regions, destination markers, or transitions to different places within your sessions as we go through in further videos. Then you've got your 3D preview, which won't actually work because these are essentially in mono at the moment, so we're not using any sort of directional besides just panning left and right. That's the only thing that's really available to happen in here. More on that in a second. Your parameters here, so this is what, if we go into, say, footsteps, and I choose this footstep surface type, this would be a parameter which we can switch between wooden footsteps. Oh, why is that playing in the background? Let's move that out of the way a second because that's going to confuse us. More on that later. So grass footsteps, carpet, and wood. Let's turn that loop off. This is still in the way. Let's move that out the way. Let's put that over there. Sorry about that, guys. Let's go back into surface type. Wooden, grass, carpet. More on that in a second. But the idea is that the parameter, you can create as many of these as you like, and they will live in window, and then you can go into preset browser, and then you've got your parameters, all of which will live here. Let's delete that parameter 1 because it's not talking to anything at the moment. We're just interested in surface type. It's the only one I've created. So your parameters is what you set and you design to speak to the game. So it could even be a parameter is, say, rain. So maybe you've got a character who's walking into a forest. It starts to rain. And so there'd be a parameter from normally from 0 to 100. And that would switch between there being rain in the soundscape or there not being rain in the soundscape. And it may be that as the rain starts, thunder comes in, etc., etc. Certain animals start to appear within the forest scene, but you might just want a general loop region to just play almost like a calm forest before you get to that point. So let's not worry too much about parameters just yet, but this is the only example I'm going to give you in this video is between switching a surface type and playing one of 9 sounds. In total, 3 of course within each bank, which we can see within this multi-instrument playlist. So if we create a new event and we go for a 2D timeline, the only thing, like I said before, which makes it a 3D timeline is if we add a spatializer. So if I right click here in the deck and I add a spatializer, suddenly we've got all these different channels appear. And we can move this to here between the different speaker sets. This is in 5.1. Or you can move up here, which will give you a 3D XY of the player as they move around. So it's just a good preview for you to kind of demo, well, what does my footsteps sound like if it's moved to the left or it's moved to the right? You'll use different sheets for different things. Most of the time, say for instance the footsteps of the character, they don't really necessarily need positioning in terms of being on a 3D timeline because it's mostly the listener in, say, Unity is mostly going to be fixed on the player, and your footsteps will be heard essentially right in front of you as you normally would as if you walk. And then the only spatialization will actually come from external reverbs, which then react to the actual environment in which the player is walking. Whereas if you had, say, a timeline or an event, say like a 3D action timeline, within here you might have, say, a radio sound which is then mapped to a location, in which case this would be dragging, the game engine would be dragging the actual source and placing it where the character may well be to give it a sense of it's moving in space. So in that example, the radio would actually be the emitter of the sound. You're the listener because you're the player. And then depending on if the radio is, say, in this corner up here where this front right speaker is, if that's where the radio is, but you're over here, you're going to hear that sound from more of a rear echoey position. Whereas if you move towards the speaker, right now it would be on your right hand ear. Right now it'd be right in front of us, and if we were here, it would be in your left ear. I hope that makes some sort of sense, but we can dive more into that as we progress through the videos. So we've created here, let's just talk about a city ambience. So within this is actually quite a few sounds. If I go into, again, window, and I go to audio bin, and we go to ambiences, you'll see that there are bird sounds, there are city sounds, of which there is traffic, there are dogs, and there's forest sounds as well. Within character, we've currently got footsteps and then a variety of different floors. Now, you need to be really aware of this at this stage, where your assets are stored. You can go to FMOD Studio, into Preferences, and you can actually set a default assets folder should you like. Be aware that by default, it will set your assets folder to the assets within where your main master session lives. I pay a lot of close attention to this because I've seen a lot of people do this, including myself at times, where you're in the door, say you're composing a piece of music and you're adding in some samples, or you're picking up some samples from somewhere and they're going into your session. You just get into the creative flow and you forget where those files are saved. But you don't necessarily care because it's your session, it's your song on your computer, right? And you might bounce that out, as a WAV and then upload it or send it to an engineer to be mastered, say. Or you'll save a new copy out, say from Logic or Pro Tools, and you'll take all the audio files with it. Well, in this case, when you're working in FMOD, it might be that you're probably going to hand over all these assets to the games designer or to another colleague, and you need to essentially be able to submit that assignment folder with all your, potentially your DAW sessions, all your FMOD sessions, and maybe even your source files, so someone can come in and audition what the original sound was before we got destructive in the DAW. You've got all your assets that actually live within the main hierarchy of the FMOD session, and in turn they will map to your window and your audio bin, and they'll update on the fly. If you suddenly drag in, say, character, and you've got footsteps enemy or footsteps player, you would, as you drag those new sound sources into your assets folder, which in our case is living on the desktop, and we're in week 4 games, and then I've got assignment FMOD assets next to my master session. Anything I drag into that assets folder, so if I create a new file now called enemy, and I put it into character, nothing's appeared here because there's not actually an audio file within there. But the second I go into character, say I copy just one of these footsteps over and I put it into enemy, now I've got an audio file living within enemy. So if I go back to FMOD and I go into character, enemy has now appeared because there's a file been added into that folder. So this is live whenever we change things and wherever we move through our session. You can also go to the assets kind of box here, so to speak, or tab, and it will do the same thing in that it'll update files as they go. But be aware, anything you delete from any of these files will be removed from your session. So if I suddenly come on here and I delete this footsteps here in my enemy folder, it's going to come up saying deleting this asset will remove all reference and remove them from the disk, and you can't undo it. I'm okay to do it in this circumstance because I'd copied it over from the snow file here, so it's a direct copy. But you do need to be aware that by doing that, you have just removed that file from the main hierarchy. So proceed with caution when it comes to deleting files. I would personally recommend that you delete them from your main file structure within your assets folder and not from within FMOD itself. So okay, say we come into this cityscape here. So the first thing we've got here is this is 2 audio files. And if we look at what it's been named, this is a balcony, right? I've got a road name and I've got it's got police, wind, cars, and it's a left channel. This is also a right channel. Now, in a sense, we've added an extra step into our process here in FMOD that we didn't need to do, because if you put those two files into, say, Pro Tools Logic, and you panned them left and you panned them right and you did some treatment on them, you wouldn't now have to do this in FMOD. So right now, if we play this file, you can see that in terms of our in and out, it's just a mono channel going straight in and straight out. What we really need to do here now is add a panner. So if we right click, we add an effect, and we add just a basic FMOD panner. I personally want this to happen pre-fader, and I want it to happen off the get-go. See, it now says automatic. Well, it's automatic because it's detected it's a mono file. It's not going to just say, well, I'm a stereo file or I'm a 714 file. You need to now tell it, well, actually, I want you to be a stereo file, and I want you to pan hard left. You can hopefully now hear that we've got more of a central channel, which is still this right side, which has not been panned. But we've now got a sense of stereo in terms of our left side we can now hear. So let's do the same for this side. We're going to right click, add an effect. We're going to add a panner. I'm going to move it so that it's pre-fader, pre this guy here. I'm going to say I want you in stereo and I want you to the right. And now we can hopefully hear that we've actually got a stereo town that's being played. Another thing I've done here is I've added some EQ. So if I click this off to bypass it, and I click this off to bypass it, suddenly you've got a lot more noise that's been put into the recording, which I personally thought was problematic. So I put the EQ in, and I've basically attenuated some of the lows, attenuated some of the highs. Of course, you can do this in the DAW with more, let's just say, EQs which are slightly more high-end in terms of their output, and we might be used to using more than just 3 pots to turn down what we're doing. Of course, you can set the X low and the X high, and you can set the scope. You can also add a parametric EQ, or a multi-band EQ. And that will give you a little bit more control in which you might be used to actually using, where you can set these to a low shelf or a high shelf. So let's just set that to a low shelf. Now you can start shelving or cutting your bottom end. Same for here. We might do a high shelf. Now I can shelf up. Bear in mind that it's picked up. If I take that out of the mix, it should pick up that that's now changed. So yeah, we can cut and we can add. So it's whatever EQ that you kind of want to use is going to help you out. Bear in mind that most of these presets, if I pause it for 1 second, can be automated. So if you right click here now and add automation, you've suddenly now got a multi-band channel EQ, which you can click here and you can actually drag automation around that particular part of the track. And you'll see that will start to move in real time. Reasons why you might want to do that, it might be that there's a parameter for, say, cover. So as the player finds cover in, say, a rainy scene, you might automate your top end to diminish or your bottom end to diminish so that you're just getting the rain patterns on top of the player. That's like a creative reason for doing that. But let's remove this for the minute and just try and keep this a bit more simple. So in terms of automation, we've got volume automation already in place. So again, you can right click. You can say, we're saying show automation because we've already added it. But say a track like this that doesn't have automation, excuse me, you can right click, say add automation, and we can now click in this line and start designing our curve in terms of how we want the volume automation to function. Let's undo that for now. If you come into something like pan, you can right click, you can add automation, and you can do the same thing. Now we've got a panner automation here. So you could pan from left to right. I don't know, say you want footsteps to move from one area to another, which I can't see why you'd necessarily want to do when you're designing game sound, because you just put that onto a 3D sheet if you wanted it to have some sense of direction. But it's just an example of why you might want to do that. Another thing that's worth saying is that if we come into the volume control and we hold down Option when we drag this volume bar, you see this green section has now popped up. Well, what that basically means is it's almost setting a starting point. So if I just press play, stop, play, stop, play, stop, you should notice that the volume switches in certain places. So that means that the sound is actually going to start at random at different levels. It's not always going to be at 0 dB. It's going to jump between different points, but your maximum volume is 0 dB. So again, it's just adding spontaneity into your session. But let's undo that for now. So when we talk about a loop region, if we solo these two elements, and this here is, I created it initially as a loop region. So I came in, I right-clicked, I said add a loop region, and we get what's, I suppose, like a cycle in Logic come up. Now, when we're currently dragging this, it's going to be moving to a grid time-based system, because I suppose we can see this also like music. Well, again, if you come in and you hold Option while you drag that, you're now in what we might call slip mode in Pro Tools, where you're not adhering to any sort of grid. Whereas if you don't hold Option, you're just snapping to divisions within the time. So Option will allow you to drag outside of this. Now, the difference between a magnet region, which is what this is, and a looping region, for the eagle-eyed of you there, when we click on this red loop, down the bottom here in mode, it's set to magnet, whereas the mode with this is set to looping. Now, the difference is no matter where I am within this session, if I press spacebar to play, we always default back to that main starting point. Whereas a loop region will only loop once it actually reaches the end of the transition. So this is fighting me now because I'm clicking outside of the region and it's pulling me back to where I want to go. So if we put that for a moment to a loop region, what will happen now is I can play right from the beginning of the session. Let's just put both these in. So we need to hold Shift to do that. Shift will add multiple elements to solo. So now we're in a looping region. I can play from wherever I want to, and it will play from the start of the session, and it will continue to play until it gets to the end of this loop region, at which point it will loop within the parameters you set. And we're looping again. Now, part of the reason that was really abrupt is because I've got volume automation on. If I get rid of this volume automation on both of these tracks, let's bring it back to the loop region. You're now looping with no obvious issue to the fact that you've been looping that region. So that's the main difference, guys. It might be that a player enters a scene and you have some sort of automation, say, on the volume. So maybe we start quite low down in volume and we raise into the scene. So let's do that for both. So maybe you start like this. It's a little 2. Let's drag it to that first part. So player enters the world. Let's zoom right in here. So scene's loading. Player enters into the world. And we get a nice fade into the scene. Well, let's drag this down a little bit so it's not eclipsing my voice. That's all well and good in terms of the start of the scene, but say the player gets to this section here and then they go off and make a cup of tea. You don't want it to loop back to the start of the scene like that, where it's got to pan in. You'll want it to return or to stay at the same volume throughout. So let's just put this back to 5 dB. So you've gone off to make a cup of tea now, right? And the game's just rolling in the background. You're going to want it to essentially continually keep looping on that same section that you've set. So we're just coming up to the 30 seconds now, and we're going to loop back round. See, there's no obvious... we haven't gone back to the start, whereas if we looped back to the beginning, you're going to now have this automation section, which you perhaps only wanted to kind of ease the player into the level or part of a loading screen, right? So that's the main reason you might want to do that. But in my case, for the demonstration, because I wanted to talk about these sections here, where we're talking then about multiple instrumentation tracks and scatterer instruments. So I actually wanted a loop region that would continue to play regardless of where I was. So we're going to change this back to being a magnet region. So it's magneting to start at that point. So you could design it differently. You could just say, that's how I want my world to start. I don't want any of this information here whatsoever. And then you could literally just cut your tracks in place. So you can set your playhead, select your audio track, and choose to essentially split between the two. That's one way of doing that. Or you can, of course, choose your editor and go Command-E, and that will create a split. While we're in this view, it's worth talking about the fade. So if we come to now any part of this section, say we go to the left-hand side here, I can click, and I can, when the icon comes up that looks like that, I can click and drag, which creates a fade. One thing FMOD's good as well is that if we drag an element over another, it will fade one out and one in for us, which I think is a really useful thing to do. So there's a little bit just on fades there. Obviously, dragging from left to right will just cut your audio file. And again, holding down Option will ignore the grid, as opposed to that snapping to a grid. If I hold Option, we're now in what we might call slip mode from a Pro Tools perspective. But let's undo all of that, because I have chosen to go for a magnet region. So let's call this City Environment Left. That's too long. Let's just call it City Left, City Right. And we've created our loop region. Like I said, we just right click there and we said we're going to add a loop region, and I happened to change it to be a magnet. I said the probability was always on and the chance was 100%. That means that that's always going to loop in that section, but you could say it might not all the time. So it might have a chance. Let's put the chance right down here. So it's a 14% chance that that magnet region will now happen. If we can see that. So here's another way you can set novelty within your game. But for the demonstration, we want the chance to be 100%. We'll talk more about the probability and chance when we speak about these instrument tracks. So these are dogs. So let's double click and call those dogs. So I've created a multi-instrumenter track, and the way I did that was by going into my audio bin. Of course, I've got ambience, I've got dogs, and this is courtesy of my sister's dogs in Carlisle. We've got these 3 audio tracks. So if I just drag one into the session, it's going to put it as a single instrument within the track. It's just a single audio file, right? It's like these are. What we want is a multi-instrument track. So you can create that. You could just right click and say, I want a multi-instrument, and it will add the container. Then you can click the first file, hold shift, click the second, click the last, and drag it into this window or drag it into that window. Or you can simply choose the 3 files and just whack it on the timeline and it will do it for you. However you want to approach that is fine. The first thing you might notice is these audio files seem to sort of fill the entire width of this multi-instrument, whereas these don't. So we click async here, and that basically will contextualize your 3 files within this block and in a sense ignore the timeline itself. You kind of want to do that for instruments or multi-instruments like this where it's an environment. So let's delete this multi-instrument and let's come to the one we've programmed. Can we see that B just played there? A just played there. B again. And C. So this is a randomizer that can be set here where we've got 3 files, so they're going to play 33% of the time. Now you might want this first bark to be more pronounced, so you might choose to right click on that. You're going to set a play percentage and you're going to want it, double click in there, look, you're going to want that to play 50% of the time. And therefore the other instances are going to play 25% of the time. A, C, A, B, C, A, C. So it's a randomizer in a sense, right? Remember we talked before about probability? So you can trigger different behaviors and you can say the probability of this even playing is 30%. Nothing played. C played. Nothing played. Nothing played. Nothing again. Nothing again. A played. So the idea is that if this magnet loop section is looping round and around and around and around and around, the probability of you hearing the dogs barking is 30% each time it moves past this loop. The probability of hearing this first dog sound is 50%. The probability of hearing dog sound 2 or 3 is 25%. So as you design this, you could change this. You could say, actually, I always want to play this side of the track, but actually, right-click again, set play percentage, double-click. I want 80% of the time to hear dog bark C. So you're hearing C the majority of the time, at a 100% chance. Another instrument you can add, and bearing in mind you can do all the same, you can add automation to all these different parts. Remember you could hold option and change how loud that may or may not start. So you're adding more novelty within the design of your game. Another track to consider here, this is birds in this case. This is what we call a scatterer instrument. So here we've got, 1, 2, 3, 5 different sounds. If I solo just this part here, what we're doing is we're spawning all these different sounds and we can change just the spawn rate. So this sounds more like an aviary or more like there's a lot of birds playing here, right? Or we could change the spawn rate to be a lot lower. So there's going to be periods of silence now. Let's put that a bit higher. Polyphony is more about how many sounds are playing at once. So you notice when we set it to 1, it's just playing 1 sound. Whereas if I set this to 12, we've only got 5. So it's going to constantly keep playing. And then your spawn rate will decipher how many of these birds are heard at a given time. And again, you can right click on this and you can add automation. So you can change this as the player moves on. That spawn rate is going to go between sort of 56% and all the way up here to 210. Let's put the dogs back in. Everything's back in now, the ambience and everything's there. And then we go back to start. The bird sounds will naturally play out. And then we've come back to just hear the dogs and the ambiences. In a sense, I hope there's enough to play with there in terms of getting your ambiences, say, created. And remember, be creative with this, guys. It could be a forest. So instead of city sounds, it's a forest sound, and perhaps there's a barn, and there might be sheep, there might be pigs, there might be chickens, there might be cockerels. You could just keep adding these sounds as you go. One more thing I'll talk about before I leave you for this video is a different type of parameter for yourself. So we've spoken about the multi-instrument before, but we haven't talked about why you might use that in the capacity of a parameter. So let's design that again from scratch. So we're going to right click, going to go for a new event. I'm going to want a 2D timeline, but I'm actually not too interested in this part of it whatsoever. What I really want to do is create a new parameter. So we've already got a parameter surface type, but we're going to create another one. So by right clicking here, go into parameter sheet, new parameter, we'll call this surface demo. You don't want continuous for this example. Continuous would be that the parameter goes from, say, 0 to 1 or 0 to 1000. And that's a time-based parameter. So you might have a looping ambient, say, but something happens between 0 and 1000, say heavy rain. So as you almost pan through the parameter, rain will be really heavy at 1000 and really light at 0. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're looking at what's called a labeled parameter. And a labeled parameter gives you can add as many of these as you like. And what this does is it gives you the ability to jump between different scenarios. So if we call this carpet, if we call this wood, and I can't remember what the other one was now. If we call it, say, what was it? Grit or something, or dirt. Our initial volume is carpet. So that's the first parameter that will be loaded in this set. So if we go OK, you notice we've now got carpet, wood and dirt. Now I don't know if it was dirt, so let's go into window and let's check our audio bin. Character, footsteps, grass. We can preview this, by the way, by just clicking autoplay. And then you'll always get a preview of what that sound is. So it's actually grass. So let's edit this parameter, which we can do by clicking this guy in the corner. We can right click, we can say edit parameter, and let's change that to be grass. So now we've got carpet, wood and grass. So now what you can do is go back into your audio bin, move this slightly out of the way so we can see what we're doing. Character, footsteps, let's choose carpet. Let's drag it onto carpet. Let's choose grass. Let's drag it onto grass. Let's choose wood. Let's drag it onto wood. And now you've got the same premise again. So when you're in carpet, or wood, or grass, you can change the probability again. So this is 33% here. You might want to pitch this slightly. Or indeed, on each one of these different parts, see this master comes up. So you could pitch just that footstep if you're not quite happy about it. You could change the start offset, which means that the footstep won't be as instant when you first play it. See these sound files, there's a slight delay in when they start. Maybe this second file, which we're on here, wouldn't actually make sense to put the offset on that. Maybe we want the offset on the third file. It's hard to hear. Try and loop it. Okay, it's ignoring me. In terms of where you're hearing that, that was far too delayed. So maybe we just want a 4% offset. That's better. So when that third file is now playing, it's slightly delayed to bring it a bit more in time with the other files. So again, you could just go into each one of these files and edit that. You could jump in and cut the file. So say we drag in, we go back to window, we go to audio bin. Character, footstep, carpet, It was the third one. You could drag that into the timeline. Get rid of this. Zoom in. As far as you could go. And just click where you want to go. Command E. It's probably a little bit too close. So maybe we actually can just drag it in like that. Then you could right click. You could say new loop region. Sorry, not loop region. Replace audio with trim copy. And now you've got another version of that footstep, which is here, trimmed. And then that could be dragged in, so you could get rid of that third file and you could drag your trimmed version in. So that's one way you could do it, and you can see now the audio is actually snapped right to the beginning, which in this example is actually worse. So let's get rid of our trim file. Let's go back. There you go. And you're back in. Some parts to think about there, guys. I'm interested to hear how you get on with that. If you've managed to design your own little cityscape, please do send it to me because I'd like to hear what you've done. Get creative with some of these elements. Remember, you can always add different effects. You know, if you suddenly want to add, I don't know why you'd add a chorus effect to an ambience, but say the dogs, you wanted them to have a little bit more of a bit distortion on them, even to bring them out a little bit more gain. Nothing stops you from putting a little bit of distortion, really low level, solo the dogs. Probability. It's obviously far too much. But you can see that that is affecting that particular channel. Take it out. That's a bit better. Delay. Way less feedback. Way wet level. Keep the dry level up. But that might work against your ambience. And again, your wet level can be automated. So have fun, guys. Let me know how you get on. And I'll see you in the next video.